Okay, so let's make this the last video of sort of today, and we'll take a look at what we got here. Not difficult. So I think we're making some good progress, and Sydney is debating these differences between historians and philosophers and poets. So let's see what else Sydney has to say here. Um, it says, you know in your own mind what's right and wrong. You got to get inspired. Since nature, we know it is. Since in nature, we know it is well to do well, what is well and what is evil, although not in the words of art which philosophers bestow upon us. For out of natural conceit, the philosophers drew it, meaning they figured it out from looking in their own minds that were created by God, and you can figure it out the same way. You don't even need a book to know right from wrong. But to be moved to do that which we know, right? To be inspired to change, or to be moved with desire to know, that is the work. That is the labor. Right? You gotta want. It's not just right from wrong. You gotta want to do it. And philosophy and poetry is gonna get you to do that more. Okay, good. So we're heading into the next stretch here now. And then and by the way, you can see on the form I put little dot dot dots. Every time I put a little dot dot dot, it means that I've skipped something because I try to really grab these. This thing is like 50 pages long. I tried to just grab like the most important bits. Basically, I had to read a pile of stuff when I was an undergraduate, and now 20 years later, I only remember a handful of the really important bits that like hit me in my brain and took my head off, and I was like, oh shit, this is amazing. I'm going to remember this the rest of my life. And then I took those bits that I was going to remember for the rest of my life, and I'm giving them to you. So you're just getting, you basically, I'm like a filter. You know, I read 1,000 books, and you get like 30 pages from me. And by the way, if you're interested in more, if you see a philosopher and you're like, shit, this guy's smart, I want more of this, you can get the whole book he wrote or the whole essay he wrote or whatever. So if you would like to sort of keep going with this thing, you absolutely can. So next up, Sydney's going to take on Plato directly. So he talks about the imputations. These are the accusations that have been given to poets. So he begins by listing off. He says, people sure do hate poets. Here are the bad things that people say about poets. And this is what he comes up with. By now we get to the most important imputations laid to the poor poets, the accusations. For aught I can yet learn, they are these. So he's going to list them. First, that there are many other more fruitful knowledges a man might better spend his time in than this. Right? So number one, people say, look, poetry's fine, but Jesus Christ, do something more important with your life. I bet your mom says stuff like that to you for majoring in writing and literature. She'd probably rather have you be an accountant or something, or respiratory therapy. So that accusation about why poetry is bad, because Jesus Christ, aren't there more important things to be doing than poetry? People said that in 1500, and they still say it today. Okay, let's see what else people don't like about poets. Right now he's just listing off what other people say. Secondly, that it is the mother of lies. That's Plato. That's Plato. Plato said that poetry is the mother of lies. That this world is an error, taking us away from the higher heavenly world, and that poetry is just lies, just things. It's a list of things that aren't true. It's a bunch of nonsense people. Poets just make stuff up, and they make all these characters up, and they make this whole world up, and it's garbage. And again, I want to remind you, and I think I said this before, but it's important to remember that for a lot, when we think about poetry, we're often thinking about love poetry. But when these guys are thinking about poetry, the idea that all poetry should be like love poetry, personal expression, was invented by a guy named Wordsworth, who's one of the philosophers we will get to in this class later on. He's the very first philosopher in the next unit. But what you need to remember is when these guys are talking about poetry, don't picture love poetry. Honestly, picture Hamlet. Hamlet is, I know it's not poetry, it's a play, but it's kind of poetry. It's written in verse, and it's like poetry. But they're thinking about things like the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are poems that are about they're big narrative poems with characters fighting a war and living and dying. And a lot of it's like made up with sea monsters and all kinds of shit. And so, number one, people say there's got to be something more important to study than poetry. This stuff is ridiculous. Number two, it's all lies. Don't study things that are lies. And that's Plato. Plato's the one that thinks it's all lies. Okay, thirdly, here's the third thing, that it is the nurse of abuse, infecting us with many pestilent desires, which a siren's sweetness drawing the mind to the serpent's tail of sinful fantasies. And herein especially comedies give the largest field to plow, as Chaucer says. How both in other nations and in ours, before poets did soften us, we were full of courage, given to martial, that's warlike exercises, and pillars of men like liberty, and not lulled asleep in idle shadiness with poets' pastimes. So he says, listen, a lot of people say that poetry causes sin. So number one, people don't like poetry because there's got to be something more important to do. Number two, people don't like poetry because it tells lies. That's what Plato says. But Plato also agrees with this third thing, which is that it makes people weak. Because if you spend your time reading books, when you should be exercising, or you should be fighting battles, and you shouldn't be like, if you're reading. One of the funny things that strikes me is it's amazing to me how many people really love superhero movies, but don't like. People really like superheroes, but that's not the same thing as like wanting to go to the gym and look like a superhero. So one of the claims about poetry is that like it's enjoyable to read, but like it's just making everybody lazy. Same thing people say about video games, just eats up all of your time. So there's one more complaint that Chaucer said. It's one more complaint that Sidney says about poetry. He says, and lastly, and chiefly, they cry out with an open mouth as if they had overshot Robin Hood that Plato banished him out of his commonwealth. Truly this is much, and there be much truth in it. So he's finally mentioned Plato by name. And he's mentioning, when he says banish them out of the commonwealth, he means he's kicked them out of his perfect society. And that's because the book in which he talks about poets being bad is The Republic, and that's about a perfect society. So what remains, and there's not that much that remains, we're not going to finish this today, but what remains is Chaucer is going to, it's a defensive poesy. He's defending poetry from people that say bad things about it. So just like in a 101 paper, he's listed off all of the bad things people say about poetry, and next up he's going to say, listen, let me tell you, this is all wrong. I'll tell you why this is totally fine. I think I got a mosquito bite. Really get me. So he says, let me tell you why. It's okay why poetry's good and people shouldn't trash it. So he says, first, let me say the first thing about the first complaint, that a man might spend his better time is reason indeed, right? So he says it is true that maybe you could spend your time doing other things. But it doth, as they say, to return or revert to the beginning. For if it be, I affirm, that no learning is so good as that which teaches and moves to virtue, and that none can both teach and move thereto as much as poesy, then the conclusion manifests that ink and paper cannot be to a more profitable purpose employed. He says poetry, when you read poetry, you feel inspired. When you see heroes in poetry, and again, remember, a lot of the poems are about ancient Greek heroes. When you see heroes in poetry, it inspires you to be a good person like a hero. So he says, I think it's a great thing to do with your time. If it makes you into a better human being, what could be more valuable? And certainly, though a man should grant their first assumption, it should follow, methinks, very unwillingly, that good is not good because better is better. So people can go, oh, there are better things to do. Well, there may be better things to do, but that doesn't make this bad. It doesn't make it. There may be better things to do with your time, but it doesn't make poetry, just because there are better things to do with your time than poetry, doesn't make poetry bad. I think that's an extremely good point. I like the way he puts it too. It's a little bit silly, but that good is, people say that good is not good because better is better. Meaning, right, that something is still good. Even if there's something better, the first thing's still good. But I should still and utterly deny that sprung out of earth a more fruitful knowledge. So he thinks poetry is really, and I like that he says knowledge. He thinks poetry is a type of knowledge, and that it is valuable because it is a kind of knowledge. And that's one of the points I'm going to be making over and over again, that poetry isn't just some silly world to spend time in. It's a type of thinking, that art is a type of thinking. And I make this point over and over again in all my classes. In my 101, I teach philosophy like Plato, but I teach Shakespeare, I teach Kafka, and I teach movies. And I promise you, Shakespeare's a kind of thinking, Kafka's a kind of thinking, and movies are a type of thinking every bit as much as Plato is. So, all right, cool. All right, so I think I'm probably going to have to wrap this up now. I don't think I have time to do the final paragraph before the end of the day, but thank you for joining me, and thank you for getting through this, the fourth day of class. And I hope that you will go to the discussion board and discuss some of these issues. Tell me what you think about it. Is he right? Is Sidney right about this? What do you think of these complaints about poetry? Do you have examples of people in your life who've said things like this to you, or can you think of examples from movies or TV shows or books or things where people claim this stuff? And what do you think of it? Do you think Sidney's right that poetry is better for inspiring people, and philosophy or history? I don't know. I think it's interesting. So, okay, thank you for joining me for this, and I will see you in the next class.